Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimche. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, better known as Rashi, was one of the most influential writers and commentators in all of Jewish history. For close to 1,000 years, there's rarely been a Jewish child or adult who has studied either the Bible or the Talmud without consulting the writings of this 11th century sage. The most influential of Rashi's writings has been his commentary on the Torah, which over time became the foundational text for all who seek to study the Chumash, be they beginners or experts. One of the most widely studied and printed books in all of Jewish history, Rashi's commentary has occasioned hundreds of super commentaries and has generally been treated as the point of departure for all his successors in the field of biblical commentary. Today we shall be taking a look at this extraordinary work and exploring its essential characteristics, its principal objectives, and its reception history. Joining us for this conversation is Dr. Eric Lawee, a professor of Bible studies at Bar-Ilan University. Professor Lawee has taught at Stanford and York universities and has written widely in the field of biblical interpretation in the medieval and early modern periods. His latest book, Rashi's Commentary on the Torah, Canonization and Resistance in the Reception of a Jewish Classic, published by Oxford University Press, was the winner of the National Jewish Book Award in 2019. It is a pleasure to have Professor Lawee on the podcast of Jewish Ideas today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to join. And I have I should add a long and pleasant history with Torah in motion. So glad to continue that.
Excellent. So obviously there's an enormous amount to cover in terms of the commentary. But before we do, let's situate ourselves a little bit historically and what's going on. If you could perhaps give us a brief overview, Rashi's life, his times, his education. Let's begin from there.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of his life, we actually know less about Rashi than we sometimes know about great post-Talmudic figures. I guess we should start with the fact that Rashi is an acronym, not the way his parents summoned him to dinner, and that stands for something roughly like Shlomo Yitzchaki or Solomon ben Isaac. His dates are circa 1040 to 1105. I guess we don't have to worry too much about spoiler alerts, so we can say that he is the great founder of the Ashkenazic school of biblical commentary and Talmudic commentary, and his achievement, I like to quote the wonderfully succinct assessment of my teacher, Isidore Tversky of blessed memory. He used to tell Harvard undergraduates that Rashi wrote the two classic commentaries on the two classics of Judaism, namely the Bible, especially the Torah, and the Babylonian Talmud. If we talk about some of the main turning points in his life, he studied in the great rabbinic academies, the Yeshivot of Germany. He returns to France, to Troyes, and that becomes the decisive point of departure for the Northern French School of Jewish Learning. In 1096, we know the traumatic event of the First Crusade unfolds. It's called in France, but it mainly affects Jewish communities in Germany, and he dies in 1105, so we can say that it's 9 years after the First Crusade. I guess zooming out, we're talking about that part of the world that already in the Middle Ages Jews called Ashkenaz, that is Europe north of the Alps. Originally, that term was applied to Germany, and then it spreads to northern France and to England.
Right. The old joke is that Rashi's dates are 1040 to 1105. Look how much he accomplished in 25 minutes.
Some people want to extend his life further because even granting him 65 years, it seems almost unfathomable. I would say even unfathomable that a single individual managed to achieve what he did. Well, it should be added being a major communal leader, not an ivory tower academic with only research papers to write.
Right. So before jumping into sort of the content and the ideas of Rashi's commentary on the Torah, which I think can fairly be stated as his magnum opus, let's talk a little bit about the text. And what I mean by this is that actually, if one does research into this particular topic, one finds that the text of Rashi's commentary on the Torah is difficult to arrive actually at the original text, because we have many variant manuscripts and many different versions of it, and we don't really have a sort of a pristine, what they call an ur-text, a sort of a single original text. So could you perhaps shed a little bit of light on how many variations or what kinds of variations there are, and how can we arrive at a consensus on what actually Rashi wrote in his Pirush on the Torah?
Right. So this is a fact that you're quite right to mention, and that came to light much more in recent decades with the greater awareness of manuscript traditions. You could almost put it this way: Rashi suffers from his overwhelming popularity and hence he comes down in more manuscripts than any other Jewish writer of the Middle Ages. And we don't have an autograph. In fact, even the earliest manuscripts are relatively late. So we have over 200 full and partial manuscripts, and the question then becomes, how do we identify what left Rashi's pen, on the assumption, which is a proven fact, that there are later accretions. And this gets us into something of a methodological thicket that we probably shouldn't get into too deeply, but there are different scholarly approaches to how to address that. A simple thing to do would be to say, well, if you find a comment across every last manuscript, that's an authentic comment. Not everyone would even agree with that, but that would be a very strict requirement that would be very hard to meet. A standard view, I think this is the view of Avram Grossman. We should mention a great Rashi scholar who passed away just this past week. Standard view is that something like 90% of the standard edition of Rashi, which issues from the Second Rabbinic Bible, Second Mikra Gedolot, printed in Venice, 1524, 1525. 90% of that is probably something that Rashi wrote in one way, shape, or form, and then there are these later accretions. There is one manuscript that has been discussed in great detail in recent decades, called Leipzig Manuscript 1, and that's a manuscript that claims authority and authenticity on the grounds that it was copied from a version of Rashi's commentary that was in the possession of Shmaya, who is his sort of Talmid Chaver, his student, and sometimes described as secretary. And it was very diligently annotated so as to indicate places where later additions were made. So we do have some ground rules, but there are sometimes debates among scholars about what counts as the original Rashi.
No, fair enough. It's just something I think everyone ought to know, that of all the books, all the great sort of canonical Jewish books we have, actually one would hope that we have a very sort of reliable text of exactly what Rashi says. And the answer is actually it's far more fluid than one might hope.
Maybe along similar lines, at a certain point, the Christian censors also got into the act of revising. We'll put those that word in quotation marks. Versions of Rashi when they found things that were not to their liking, and it was really only with the emergence of easy availability of manuscripts that one could go back behind the printed editions to get to something closer to Rashi's commentaries, especially in works that did have more anti-Christian material, as commentary on Psalms, commentary on Song of Songs, and so on. Okay.
Interesting. Okay, so let's jump into the commentary itself. Now, unlike many other commentaries on the Torah, Rashi didn't have an introduction where he laid out his methods and his purpose and everything. However, I was wondering if we could perhaps deduce that from the commentary itself. So, Rashi's commentary, can we know from what's written within, his purpose, why he wrote it, what lacking or what what did he see that prompted him to spend all this time trying to write this? What were the basic methods that he attempted to use? What were his priorities in terms of trying to understand the text? I mean, what can we deduce from the commentary itself that might shed light on these issues?
Okay, so first of all, you make the important point that there is a tradition which really traces back to Greek writings and then through the Arabic tradition comes into Hebrew, of writing introductions to works, where often writers will spell out, this is what I'm trying to do, this is how I'm trying to do it, this is my intended audience. That tended to be the province almost exclusively of Jewish writers in, let's call it, the Mediterranean, Southern Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean zone. And you're quite right, Ashkenazic writers tend to say, I'm commenting on this book, here's chapter 1, verse 1, I'll start commenting. In some ways, this is good for scholars. It allows us to engage in hopefully informed speculation about the sort of questions that you were just asking, but to some degree, those questions remain elusive, especially in the case of Rashi. I think most people would be able to say, on the basis of the final product, that the most striking feature of Rashi's reading of the Bible in general, and the Torah in particular, is the mixture of what he calls Pshuto shel Mikra and the classical Midrashic tradition, the older form of traditional interpretation that came down from the Talmud and various other rabbinic compendia. And those terms themselves are somewhat elusive. Much ink has been spilled trying to define what Rashi meant by those terms. In general, scholars have been challenged to try to define Midrash, and I think may have already given up on the grounds that this term stubbornly resists definition. But basically, you have a new form of interpretation that Rashi pioneers for the Ashkenazic world, called Pshuto Shel Mikra. Eventually, the term Pshat will become more familiar, often translated as the contextual sense, as the plain sense, and it feels bound to honor the rules of grammar, morphology, sequence, larger context, and genre, and so on. Midrash, the more traditional type of interpretation, is often defined in terms of a somewhat more free-form hermeneutic, sometimes described as homiletical, sometimes described as fanciful. And Rashi's magic, I suppose you could say, was to be able to combine those two in a proportion that proved abiding in terms of its attractiveness to Jews over the ages. And exactly what spurred this newer approach, the Pshat approach that Rashi takes, is something of a contentious issue among scholars. I won't go into all the various theories. Some see it more as an internal development based on his awareness of Jewish exegetical traditions in Muslim Spain. Some see it more as a product of polemical challenges in the Christian world in which he lived, or awareness of new rational approaches to text in general in the Christian world. So the upshot is, like much that surrounds Rashi, those questions are elusive. What's not elusive at all is the outcome, which is the commentary that became the commentary for Jews over the ages because of this judicious combination of the traditional and more innovative approaches that he brought together under one roof in his gloss.
That's interesting. We'll absolutely get to the extraordinary success of Rashi's commentary very soon. But I want to dwell on this just for a little bit, because as you said, Rashi, one of the most common or one of the most easily visible things that strikes every reader when reading Rashi's commentary is how frequently he brings in Midrashei Chazal, meaning homiletical readings that were already in rabbinical compendia for centuries. And the question becomes, is there rhyme and reason behind how Rashi selects and presents and invokes these midrashim? Because of course he doesn't present all the midrashim. I mean, there are thousands upon thousands of them, and he selects very judiciously. And he only selects them sometimes and not all the time. Meaning sometimes, as you say, he does go down the route of just answering a question or just making a comment as is demanded, or as follows the laws of grammar, or follows the inner narrative logic of the particular passage that he's trying to elucidate. But the question, often he does bring in Midrashei Chazal. So can one define or discern patterns in why he brings Midrashim, when he brings them, what he seeks to do with them, and how he selects them?
Another good question, to which, again, one would find a range of answers, but again, some element of consensus among those who have thought about this question long and hard. First of all, Rashi did make certain statements that have sometimes been construed as methodological statements, whether method, which might be a pertinent term for early modern or modern thought, is relevant to Rashi is an interesting question, but especially in his commentary on Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, he talks about how he's interested in this thing called Pshuto Shel Mikra. He makes a very strong statement about what might almost sound like exclusive interest, Lovatia of Pshuto Shel Mikra. That's what I'm here for, to give you the plain or contextual sense. But then he adds this category of Ha'agadah HaMiyashevet, some sort of midrash that, as you correctly stressed, has to meet some type of criterion. What that criterion is becomes the crux of the issue. And many cases, the answer is that there is some spur in the text, what Professor James Kugel would call a surface irregularity in the biblical text, some gap, some morphological oddity, or whatnot that invites, let's put it that way, some type of elaboration. But there are other cases where Rashi's Midrashim do seem to be at a far remove from the text. And this has prompted scholars more and more to move in a direction of classing Rashi's commentary as not just a work of interpretation or exegesis, but also what's often called a work of education. Rashi k'mechanech, Rashi is an educator, where his goal sometimes is to impart messages, perhaps theological or religious messages, perhaps messages that will buck up the faith of troubled believers in times of difficulty, and that he saw that as a valid goal. So on this view, many, if not most, midrashic interpretations that Rashi brings do have some spur in the text. It becomes a bit of a cottage industry among later readers to try to identify that spur. But there are midrashim which are farther removed from the text, and they may subserve a slightly different or even very different purpose that relates to Rashi's role as a leader who's trying to teach his people about holiness, about the land of Israel, about Jews as the chosen people, and so forth.
Right. Yes. It's the whole mini industry of what's bothering Rashi.
What's bothering Rashi, right?
Now centuries long. And the truth is that this tension between Pshat and Drash in Rashi's commentary and elsewhere is also a little bit jarring, because this is a point that was pointed out by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi in his book Zachar, where he points out that the biblical text generally very strongly respects chronology within a story, or even not within a story. It doesn't collapse and expand time like an accordion. Whereas the Midrashim do. In other words, a figure, Og Melech HaBashan, for example, in the Midrashic text, can figure in the story of Avram and Sarah, and in Noach, and in later with Moshe, and that's completely legitimate. Whereas in the biblical text, that can't possibly happen because someone can't live that long or can't crop up randomly in different stories at different times, different places. Same with Pinchas and Eliyahu and many other Midrashic attempts to sort of conflate personalities and stories which took place many centuries apart. And that's something that the Torah itself, the text itself, doesn't do. So, I mean, could you say, I suppose Rashi is injecting an element of that into the Torah itself. I mean, if you read Chumash with Rashi, so you suddenly, the borders of what seems to be possible within the text are I suppose, expanded in various ways.
Right. I mean, there is real continuity with what you might call the Midrashic mentality. And that mentality, as elusive as it is to sometimes define, certainly straddles the literal and the symbolic, or maybe even mythical, in ways that don't seem to trouble Rashi all that much. Even as the next comment down, he may engage in some grammatical discurses, which is part of the what you're describing as I don't know if I'd say schizophrenia, but the duality perhaps of the commentary, which can go glide easily from one to the other without too much trouble. Yes, I think in terms of examples of Rashi's comment that the donkey that Abraham used to bring himself to the Akedah when he was asked to commit the ultimate act of sacrifice and slaughter his son is the same donkey that Moses used to return his family to Egypt, and that will be the donkey described in prophetic literature that the Messiah will use to ride in on to bring about the advent of the end of days. So that's that sort of transtemporal.
That's a long living donkey.
And this is the type of thing, I'm sure we'll roll around to this. This is the type of thing where someone of a more rationalist bent says, wait a second, I don't know any donkeys like that. This defies all the laws of nature. And, I've been to many zoos and I've never seen a donkey like that. This is the type of comment that Rashi will make. And he'll simply move on. And, one sometimes really wishes one could have Rashi on your podcast of Jewish Ideas to ask him directly, what exactly were you thinking when you wrote down, not composed because he wouldn't say it on his own recognizance, but when you decided to adduce a rabbinic midrash like that? That's a very good example, by the way, where in the verse in Exodus where Rashi brings the comment, you have the definite article, hachamor, so it actually does have as textual spurs, the donkey, as if you're supposed to know which donkey we're already talking about. Oh, of course, we do know what donkey we're talking about. That's the one that Abraham already used way back when. So it's not devoid of some textual hook on the one hand. On the other hand, it takes us, as you say, to far off places that certainly transcend any notion of temporality or biology when it comes to the standard lifetimes of flora and fauna.
Yes, I suppose so. Which brings us to another topic I wanted to broach, which seems very interesting because, of course, in the centuries close to Rashi and I suppose immediately afterwards, you do have other Pirushim Torah, other Bible commentaries which are emerging in Spain, especially in Muslim Spain. They're talking about, I suppose Ramban Nachmanides in Christian Spain, but that of Avraham ibn Ezra and others. And those are different in the sense that those do seem to at least want to be beholden. I mean, this is my sense anyway, want to be beholden to some basic understanding of laws of logic or laws of science or I don't know. I mean, let me phrase the question like this. Is it possible to make the overgeneralized statement that Rashi's commentary doesn't bother with being overly educated, let's say, or doesn't seem to want to play by the rules of any external systems of knowledge, whereas those composed in Spain and elsewhere did have lurking in the background their own, let's say, scientific or literary or philosophical knowledge, which they, to some degree, wanted to hew to in some form or another. I mean, can one make that kind of dichotomy between Sfarad and Ashkenaz in this sense?
I think the way things play out, there's a lot to that notion. Rashi becomes a hero to people who are pushing back sometimes very strongly against what they see as the incursions of a scientific mentality that is not true to classical Jewish tradition. Of course, the high point of the impact of Greco-Arabic philosophy and science is in Muslim Spain. The great figure here is Maimonides, but someone like Abraham Ibn Ezra reflects that in his sort of exegetical rationalism. And even Nachmanides, who is heralded as one of the great Kabbalists of all time, for all that, is a son of Spain and is aware of these types of traditions. And so when Rashi says some of these way out or seemingly way out things, at least as perceived from the perspective of what I just called the Greco-Arabic scientific tradition, there are people who say this simply cannot be what the divine word means, because the divine word simply cannot be in that level of defiance of empiricism, of the laws of nature, and of the visible world as we experience it. I often have given the example of, and I've written about the flood story, where we're told that Hishchit kol basar darko ala aretz, all flesh corrupted its way on earth. And Rashi here follows the Midrash, and it's a good reminder the Midrash is sometimes highly literalist, and says, well, it says all flesh. It doesn't just say human beings. And Rashi says, well, that goes to show that the animals and the birds were complicit in the corruption that brought about this divine decision that the world must be destroyed. And again, he moves on to the next verse without troubling to explain to us what that might mean to him or to us. Here is a place where Nachmanides, again, not overly enamored of Aristotle, to put it mildly, says, wait a second, are animals moral agents? Are animals people who can distinguish good from bad and just from unjust? Are they punished for their misdeeds? And so on and so forth, all these implications of Rashi's comment. And after trying to make sense of the Midrash, which is characteristic of Ramban, he basically says, al derech hapshat, that's a usage Ibn Ezra coined and that he takes over. According to the plain sense, sometimes kol basar, all flesh, actually is limited to humankind, the only moral agents. So that's a good example to me where even the, let's call it more conservative and certainly Kabbalistic wing of the Spanish tradition says, wait, science teaches us certain things, and one of those things is that animals do not enjoy the capacity for moral choice such that they are punished for their misdeeds and rewarded for their good deeds. So this becomes, I think, one of the fascinating stories, how Rashi moves into new cultural environments and is either opposed on certain grounds that are present there or sometimes co-opted and appropriated.
Right. Interesting. Okay, there's much more to ask here, but there are so many topics I want to tackle. So let's move on to, I suppose, one of the big questions or major questions that I want to ask here, which is concerning whether one can discern a philosophy or central ideas from Rashi's commentary on the Torah. And one of the reasons I ask is, again, let's draw a comparison between, let's say, the Bible commentary of the Ramban or the Ibn Ezra or Abarbanel. All of these can be seen as statements of Jewish thought, right? You read the Ramban and Torah, you read the Abarbanel, a broad picture of what the Jewish religion is and what it believes can be discerned largely from these texts. Of course, not the entire thing, but they stand alone as statements. Now, here's the question: does Rashi's commentary do the same? Because Rashi seems to be much more focused on very specific points and problems and issues in the text itself. So, is there a Rashian philosophy? Firstly, and secondly, then I suppose the corollary to that would be, what is the impact of that? Has there been a Rashi school of Jewish thought, or what ideas of his can be said to have reverberated through the generation?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack, actually. I guess I would start with an interesting question I've long pondered. I've never got my head around it enough to write up anything, but one simple question is whether exegetical works make arguments. What is an argument, and do you find arguments in a running commentary which is so grounded in some pretext? So that's one interesting question. A second aspect of this, and this has been discussed already from medieval times and on into the early modern period, does Rashi contradict himself in his commentary? And that would certainly touch on your query about whether one could find some overarching themes that are coherently expressed through the length and the breadth of the Torah commentary, or perhaps all of his writings. Some people were forced to the conclusion, not very happily, that yes, he does contradict himself. We know that he sometimes brings diametrically opposed midrashic views, which suggests that he had a certain pluralistic vision that doesn't require us necessarily to come down on one side or the other of every last great humanistic question. And I think another element here is that if you think about people like Ibn Ezra or Maimonides or Nachmanides, Ramban, as great interpreters of the Bible, one aspect of their interpretation which lends coherence, overall coherence to their approach, is they had a notion of the exoteric level of Scripture and the esoteric level of Scripture. They differed as to what that esoteric meaning was, the so-called secrets of the Torah. But the notion that there were sodot and that they did bear coherence, whether it was astrological in the case of Ibn Ezra, whether it was mystical in the case of Nachmanides, whether it was philosophic Aristotelian in the case of Maimonides, gave their writings a certain coherence on that level, on the esoteric level. Rashi does not work with that dichotomy. No one ever tried to unpack the secret. I shouldn't say no one. There are some Kabbalists who see him as a recipient of divine revelation, and perhaps would read him mystically. But on the whole, Rashi is user friendly, we might say in our language, and doesn't necessarily feel compelled, I think, to develop some overall, again, to use that word, system, as perhaps other medievals did, and of course early modern and modern Jewish thinkers.
Okay, so then let me ask what I asked a bit differently. Were there later figures who saw in Rashi a coherent thinker or school of thought? In other words, yes, okay, we can read Rashi today and see, as you say, this kind of as Rashi's commentary on the Torah as a series of somewhat disparate, maybe slightly contradictory and slightly haphazard set of comments on the Torah, which are extremely enlightening, but not necessarily coherent to one grand overarching manner. But was Rashi taken at any point later on as a kind of a thinker with a very specific vision that he sought to impart, and therefore was taken as inspiration or as a progenitor, let's say, of a school of thought or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think already in the Middle Ages, I mentioned, you do have Rashi invoked against certain visions of Judaism. So it's not so much that he has a coherent, philosophy of his own, but he does teach us that the sort of extreme rationalism, sometimes promoted by followers of Maimonides, is inauthentic and even dangerous. There are some modern scholars, again, Abraham Grossman wrote a book to this effect, I would say identify, I don't know if I would call it an overall philosophy, but certain themes that were important to Rashi that he came back to over and over again. Sometimes that's apparent on the local level in terms of some comment that he makes on a verse in, Proverbs, that really doesn't demand his reference to truth and modesty, but he throws it in there anyway and suggests that this is a value of his. And then you start looking around and you see, oh, he's talking about that quite a bit. Grossman also wrote about Rashi as someone who was, relatively speaking, and we have to remember medieval standards when it comes to such things, relatively speaking, progressive, I guess we would say, when it came to women, both in terms of his rulings as a rabbi, but also in terms of his commentaries, and free of some of the negative views of women that are often associated with philosophic writers who were influenced by Greek approaches to the male-female dichotomy. So I think one can certainly talk about themes in Rashi that were important to him, and I think more could be done, in fact, to speak about Rashi as a thinker who did have ideas, even though he communicates them through a medium that's not systematic in the way that we might be used to. I would say, on the whole, people tend to see him as an expositor of Scripture, and hence they didn't tend to think so much in terms of some coherent vision that he was projecting across his corpus, or even across any given work.
Interesting. I suppose that Rashi didn't realize the enormous success and effect that his corpus would have. Meaning, if he knew that for centuries people would be poring over every single word and every single idea minutely to try, because he became such a foundational sort of textual expositor. I suppose maybe he would have expressed himself differently, or he would have tried to give over a system of thought if he knew that millions of people, generation after generation, would be so interested in it.
Rashi does seem to be amazingly self-effacing, and I imagine very few people say, "Oh, there's going to be tens of thousands of people as we speak now reading me, 1,000 years from now." But even in terms of the short-term impact, I don't know if he ever could have fathomed the degree to which he, both as the Talmud commentator and as the commentator on the Torah, would shape Jewish collective identity. I would put it that way, in consciousness, and certainly the understanding of the Torah, the Judaism's foundation document, not only for decades or centuries, but almost nigh a millennium. That's quite an achievement.
It is, and I'd like to discuss that shortly. Before that, just one or two other points. I mean, I suppose one very interesting element of reading Rashi's commentary is its style, and specifically the incredible concision with which he writes. I mean, he can put into a word or a sentence something very, an idea that others would take vastly greater amounts of words and sentences to write. He writes not just a great concision, but with very pithy and powerful short statements. Does Rashi ever indicate as to why he suffices with this? Was this something ideological? Or no, this was just a style that Rashi preferred. And secondly, did this contribute to his immense popularity? Because one could argue that, hey, maybe that Bar-Ilan's commentary on the Torah is superior in terms of ideas, but who's got the time and patience to wade through pages and pages and pages of questions and answers? I mean, you have a headache by the time you finish. Whereas Rashi, you can plausibly go through the entire parasha with Rashi every single week, and and have that as a profitable endeavor. So, I mean, to what extent did this concision play a role?
Yeah, I think we're talking about what I'd call a glossatorial culture. And culture in this case, people are writing glosses, and it's in the nature of glosses that you don't tend to write them in the manner of an Abarbanel. And he, in particular, tried to sort of embed these interpretations within the text as seamlessly as possible. So having too extensive a gloss on any given section, although there are some longer glosses, would impede that purpose. I certainly agree with you. Whatever his intent was, one of the effects was to make his works more user-friendly than some of its competitors. It was also a running commentary that pretty much tackled, at least in the case of the Torah, all the verses. So unlike some commentators who are much more sporadic, he gave you short comments, but ones that pretty much covered at least many of the questions you would think to ask. If we compare him again to the great triumvirate, members of the triumvirate that exited the Middle Ages, Ibn Ezra and Nachmanides, Nachmanides often writes at great essayistic length in ways that I think would be trying for many ordinary readers, and I suspect even not a few scholars. In the case of Ibn Ezra, you have perhaps the opposite problem. He can be so succinct and laconic that you're just left perplexed by this gnomic word or two that he graced graced us with, and can't quite figure out what it means. I guess since you mentioned Abarbanel, I should first of all defend one of my great heroes, Abarbanel, in terms of the length at which he writes. But I should also mention that in his introduction to his commentary on Joshua, he takes to task both Rashi and Ibn Ezra on the grounds that both of them are far too succinct. And he sees this as a failure on the view that the divine word has uses the image of 70 faces, Shivim Panim LaTorah, even though there he's talking about prophetic books, and says, look, we're talking about a book that's boundlessly profound, and to write as briefly as both Rashi and Ibn Ezra did shows a profound misunderstanding of the multifaceted nature of Scripture. So that's an interesting case where people or someone is aware of Rashi's succinctness, but doesn't see this, takes a dim view of it on the grounds that it really reflects what Abarbanel paints as a wrong-headed conception of Scripture.
Interesting. There's a sort of famous quote, along the lines of, "I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long letter instead."
Right. Well, it's certainly true that Rashi's art of concision is an art of concision, and every word is packed with meaning. That's certainly the way he was read, sometimes more and sometimes less, but on the whole, both as a Talmudic commentator and as a biblical commentator. He wasn't unique on that score, as you well know. Maimonides and others were read in a similar fashion, but people assumed that if Rashi said it, it demanded utmost attention to explain every facet of his verbal expression.
Right, exactly, and of course Rashi's pithiness has lasted because some of the pitgamim, some of the aphorisms which he concocted, made their way into Jewish mainstream. Ke'ish echad belev echad, or there's a variety of some such sentences that sort of became cultural coinage in a way, and that Rashi seems to have made up from whole cloth. I mean, we don't see it earlier. Before going to Rashi's reception, I guess a question that I should have asked at the beginning, which just struck me now as a curiosity, which is who did Rashi have on his bookshelf in terms of Torah commentary? I mean, who were his exemplars that came before him? And also, I suppose, was he trying to emulate or avoid emulating any of the ones that he had?
Well, first of all, there's elements here of oral tradition, which is always not only significant in Ashkenaz, but sometimes paramount in Ashkenaz. There were developments in biblical commentary prior to Rashi in the German yeshivot. Exactly who he is reading, again, is a bit a matter of speculation, and hence contentious debate among scholars, especially when they try to discern what the motives were for this innovation called Pshuto Shel Mikra. Recently, a new stratum of Byzantine Bible commentary has come to light from the century before Rashi, and there's some who would argue that provided inspiration. We certainly know, he quotes them, that he had on his bookshelf some of the great Spanish grammarians, albeit not the most up-to-date ones. Menachem ben Saruk, Dunash ben Labrat, he had those on his bookshelf because they wrote in Hebrew. Later, Andalusi Jewish grammatical writing takes place in Judeo-Arabic. There too, some have argued that possibly he had access to those works, not because he could read Arabic, he certainly couldn't, but perhaps by some sort of oral transmission. Then there were people in northern France, the Potarim. He quotes Moshe Hadarshan, as we know. It's possible, Professor Tashma tried to argue that there was some late influence of a work from Byzantium, Lekach. But on the whole, he was really finding his own path, at least as a plain sense interpreter, and also, it's important to stress, as a selector, rewriter of Midrashic interpretation. That is to say, it would be far from the truth to say that Rashi simply cuts and pastes Midrashim. On the contrary, he's working at his easel, is the way I would put it, artistically reformulating Midrashic ideas, sometimes in ways that had no precise precedent and left a lasting impact, precisely because he formulated them in ways that later writers found intriguing or problematic. But in terms of a biblical commentary in northern France, he is the man, and he sets in motion a whole school of interpretation. Some of his major followers, I guess we should note, are just offshoots of his family, especially his well-known grandchildren, Samuel ben Meir and Rabbeinu Tam, the famous Rabbeinu Tam.
Right. I suppose this is the peril of asking a good historian a question like that is almost invariably, we don't really know that much, and what we do know is an argument among different scholars. So that does seem to be a recurrent.
But I don't want to hedge too much. Certainly, the Spanish grammarians did teach him important things. The great discovery of Spanish grammar, not to get again too much into details, was that each Hebrew verb, despite what it might look like, has 3 root letters. And that's Rashi, something that Rashi is moving in the direction of, if not fully there. So those are important new features of his commentary that very much define the pshat level of his approach.
Right. Okay, let us dive into what I've been dancing around now for a while, which is the reception of Rashi, which you've written at great length, and the way he was, the afterlife and the reverberations of Rashi's commentary for centuries. So I guess the big question, the major question, is why? Why is it that this commentary became the canonical, is the word you use in the title of your book? Why did it become the canonical book for centuries and centuries? How did that happen? I mean, what did that process look like? But also, why Rashi? His success was so extraordinary that by the time the great halachic codes were being written in the 15th, 16th century, the Torah, the Shulchan Aruch, the obligation of reading Shnayim Mikra ve'Echad Targum, of reading the parsha, the weekly Torah portion twice, and its Targum and its translation once, Rashi's commentary comes in there as an option. You can fulfill your Torah obligation by reading Rashi as well, which is again is an extraordinary thing considering that it was only composed a few centuries earlier. So I suppose, yes, the big question, why and how did Rashi's commentary assume the place it assumed?
That's an excellent question, and you alluded to an excellent book that tackles at least the first 500 years of that very broad and complex topic. I think
It's an excellent book. Everyone should read it.
one of the things I would say is that it was a story that was forgotten in large measure. I think because Rashi is so much a presence in the lives of at least traditional Jews as they encounter the Bible in general and the Torah in particular, that no one really gave much thought to. We've already mentioned, I guess, some of the factors in northern France. He's grandpa to some of the people who admired him. He also is a devoted communal leader and the founder of the school. So I think the question for me becomes more, how is it that he was so successful, and he wasn't successful everywhere, but how is it he was so successful in new cultural environments? Some of it had to do, I guess, with his reputation as the Talmud commentator. Some of it had to do with his concise and digestible glosses, which we've already mentioned. Some of it has to do with his continuous running commentary, which we've also already mentioned. Perhaps we should stress something we haven't spoken about too much, which is his relationship to biblical law and not just biblical narrative. His commentary is almost wholly consonant with some version or other of Torah Shebaal Peh. That is to say, unlike some medievals, including his grandson, famously Rashbam, who was sometimes willing to daringly break with halachic interpretation, Rashi almost never does that. In some occasions he does. So that was another thing that made him a sort of congenial compendium of rabbinic interpretation. Not always the halakha psuka, the final holding in rabbinic law, but almost always some view that's found in rabbinic tradition. I think ultimately, I would say, and I think many would easily agree with me, that the midrashic component is what endeared Rashi to generations of readers, especially ordinary readers. And you think about, or I think about kindergarten teachers across the state of Israel and in many places in the diaspora. When they teach the weekly parasha, they teach even to their charges who are not yet literate the parasha with Rashi, and so it's not just a story about Abraham, but it's a story about Abraham who was thrown into a fiery furnace and who was miraculously saved, and so on and so forth. Those midrashim became beloved, and they became part and parcel of the retellings of the biblical narrative, especially the Torah, in ways that sometimes made it difficult for some people to even remember what was in the verses and what wasn't. In terms of canonicity, you're quite right, I think, to point to Shnai Mikra Ve'echad Targum is a fascinating development. I at least don't know of any other medieval work that attained halachic status. And here there were a variety of factors. This has been discussed in more detail, but the starting point for it is that the original rabbinic enjoinder was to study the original biblical text twice and then to add the Aramaic Targum. At a certain point, the Targum became obsolete and it became more of a challenge than a help for readers. And the question is what might replace it? And it was suggested by Moshe Mikutzi, the author of the Smug in early 13th century, that maybe Rashi would be a good replacement. And it didn't win automatic acceptance among all rabbis, but you're quite right. It eventually makes it into the great codes, the Torah at the end of the Middle Ages, and the Shulchan Aruch eventually in the 16th century as at least a possible substitute, or maybe even a preferable substitute to the Targum. So once it becomes a way to fulfill a weekly obligation, that obviously spurs a lot of interest in Rashi, a lot of reading of Rashi, and I would say also a lot of commentary on Rashi, formal and more formal. As people are reading it anyway, you jot an insight you had into the margins of your page, and voila, after several years of doing this, you have what scholars call a super commentary.
Yes, precisely. Although it's been pointed out, I believe that the spread was uneven and also not immediate. For example, it's been pointed out frequently that Rambam Maimonides seems not really to have heard of Rashi or not really to engage with him at all, if he had in fact heard of him. Was this surprising? Was Rashi less heard of in the Spanish and Spanish exilic community?
It is something of a perplexity that Maimonides, who's born in 1138, we mentioned Rashi dies in 1105, over the course of his long life, never heard of Rashi. His son, Abraham, Avram ben Arambam, does quote Rashi, so he has made it to Egypt by that time. There are some views that suggest that perhaps very late in life, Maimonides came across Rashi's Talmudic writings. But exactly how Rashi came to different places is often something that's a blank. We just can't quite trace when, where, and how Rashi arrived in a new cultural environment. But by the end of the Middle Ages, I think we certainly know that he has become the commentator par excellence. One way to chart that is the history of printing. And it's a remarkable fact that Rashi is printed in all but one of the early printing houses, the period of the so-called Incanabula, that is Hebrew prints before the year 1500. And that makes him more popular, but printers then as now try to print things they think will sell. And obviously there was a strong sense already by 1470, 1469, when we think the first Rashi commentary on the Torah was printed, that Rashi was of interest to people, and hence it was worth printing him.
It's been often observed that the early century or so of printers of Jewish books had an enormous power of selection and of winnowing out and basically creating the Jewish bookshelf, as it were. I mean, you mentioned the Mikrat Gedolah of 1525. The fact that triumvirate of Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Ramban was chosen, among others, to represent the classics of Parashanut, definitely decided the curriculum for many centuries. So I wanted to ask as well. I mean, so what were the effects of this canonization of Rashi? I mean, we mentioned one, the sort of the halachic effect of Rashi being welcomed in as part of a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Shnai Mikra Ve'echad Targum. But I mean, do we see? And you mentioned Israeli kindergarten teachers today still teaching Rashi as Rashi is, easy to digest and easy to sort of present and canonical figure. But do we see examples of Rashi's influence or Rashi's commentary's influence in Jewish law or thought or practice? Are there any facets of, let's say, Jewish life that can be traced to Rashi's commentary in any way?
I think on many levels, and some of that story has yet to be written. Certainly, the last 500 years of Rashi's reception is fairly wide open. We know it happened, but by whom, for what reason, in what new historical circumstances, that's something that I'm actually eager to try to find out myself. I would say in terms of the effects, one effect is many commentaries were written on Rashi. I thought when I wrote my book that he was the most commented upon single-authored Jewish text ever. One reviewer claimed that there were more commentaries on Mishneh Torah than on Rashi's commentary, but even if he comes in second, not entirely being clear sometimes, what counts as a super commentary, that's certainly a testimony to canonicity. I've often recommended this research method for those who cultivate it. You sit next to Moshe Idel sometime and you ask him a question. I asked him, what counts as a canonical text in post-Talmudic Judaism? And he said very simply and elegantly, a text that's commented upon. Think of the Zohar, think of Rashi's commentary. So that's one aspect. The other aspect I would say is there is a definition of canonicity which suggests that a canonical text or a canonical writer is someone who makes claims on later participants in the tradition, even ones who don't like him. That is to say, a minor writer who had no impact is a writer who you can ignore if you don't like him. Rashi is not someone you could ignore. And so we do have various writings of figures who I called his resisting readers, who in some cases exclusively devote themselves to refutation of Rashi on a variety of grounds, some exegetical, some theological. But the point there is that they felt that they had to address Rashi because they were apparently worried about his growing impact. There's one writer, we don't quite know his dates, whether it's 14th or 15th century. He's a pseudonymous writer who describes this process of the spread of Rashi and the wholly, from his point of view, deleterious impact it's having not just on Jewish biblical interpretation, but on Jewish spirituality writ large. I would say the other area that really needs to be researched, and it's almost shocking how little attention it's got, is starting with our kindergarten teachers, but working from there, Rashi's hugely influential role in Jewish education. And there are a lot of sources which attest to this.
What do you mean by that? Can you elaborate on that?
If you look at curricula over the ages, curricula from medieval times, fairly close to Rashi's time, down to the curriculum of religious Zionist schools in Israel versus the Mamlechti, the regular governmental schools, it tells a whole cultural story in terms of where Rashi has had impact, or where in modern times with the fragmentation of modern Judaism, increasingly he's seen as a symbol of the benighted past that that we don't wish to recapture, and certainly don't wish to transmit. I've taught many teachers since coming to Israel. We have a program in the Department of Bar-Ilan where many people who teach Bible in Israeli schools teach. Some of them teach in one system and one in the other. That is to say, the so-called secular system versus the so-called religious system. And often the secular teachers who teach Bible have heard the name Rashi, but sometimes a little more. And that opens to me a whole window on, among other things, polarization in Israeli society. But it's a good way, it seems to me, an entree into all sorts of cultural developments. I'll just mention one more in terms of the sphere of education, women's education. When did women study Rashi? How much did they know Rashi? When Beis Yaakov was formed as a school, you can look at debates about what should be taught there. And one of the debates is, can we or should we teach Rashi to girls? After all, Rashi is, as we've already mentioned many times, many snippets of Midrash, and in some cases Talmudic law. Well, if women aren't supposed to learn that, especially traditional Eastern European women, maybe Rashi is verboten, or maybe not. So a lot of, I would say, larger cultural issues open up when you look at the history of Rashi's reception, and one entree into that is educational issues. Another entree into that is places where Rashi has served as a figure or figurehead in polemics. We already mentioned the polemic over rationalism where he figures, but there are other polemics. As recently as a year or two ago, a volume was produced called Pshuto shel Mikra, The Plain Sense of Scripture, and it was viewed as heretical, nothing less. In some cases, people called for the burning of these volumes because it was seen as out to subvert Rashi, which apparently is the 14th of Maimonides' principles of faith in Judaism, that one must always, interpret the Torah according to Rashi.
That naturally, as though Ramban, Ibn Ezra, etc., didn't go out to subvert Rashi, or weren't concerned to do that. Yeah, yes, exactly. Clearly, they didn't get a particular memo. That is very interesting. I suppose again, Rashi's simplicity, ease of use, concision would have appealed to those writing these educational curricula and those formulating this, I suppose. And then you mentioned the controversy of the Rashi. I mean, one area of my own personal research is the 19th century biblical commentator Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto, and it's very interesting because he is a huge fan of Rashi. I mean, he writes in essays extolling Rashi at length. But he is a huge proponent of pshat, of plain sense media, and he seems to see Rashi as the apex of pshat, which is a very debatable position to take. But nonetheless, he takes it, and it's just very interesting that if someone is trying to write a book called Pshuto shel Mikra, but presents alternatives to Rashi, so then those who object to it, presumably the basis of their objection is that Rashi is Pshuto shel Mikra, no more, no less.
There's a long history, of course, of that debate unfolding. To what extent is this a Midrashic commentary? To what extent is it a plain sense? I did see, I think this goes back to the 1970s. I don't know if it's still cast this way, but in one of the curricula for, again, the Dati Leumi stream, the religious Zionist stream in Israeli schools, they say we basically focus on plain sense interpretation. And that means focusing on, I think the four, if I'm not mistaken, were Ibn Ezra, Ramban, maybe Rashbam or Radak, I don't remember, and Rashi. So there too, he's painted as an exemplar of the plain sense, and that reflects a certain perception of Rashi, which, as you say, at least is up for debate.
Right, interesting. The last point I wanted to get to is something that you already mentioned a little bit in passing, but actually strikes me as fascinating, especially as a section of your book, which were the objections to Rashi. In other words, we seem to have the version of history that seems to be presented to us nowadays, 21st century, is one of inexorable success, right? Rashi's commentary grows, it becomes accepted, it becomes, the standard text, and that's it, and nothing more. But actually, as you show in your book, this wasn't the case. There were times, there were places, there were individuals who rejected Rashi, or who thought Rashi was not the best option, or not even a very good option for learning Tanakh. So, I mean, could you, obviously, asking you you've written an enormous amount, and it's very sort of varied school. But I mean, just basically, who was objecting to him, and what, and when was this rejection taking place? And most importantly, on what grounds? What were the arguments of those who sought to push Rashi out of the canonical interpreters of the Chumash?
So that's a broad-ranging question, and there's certainly a range of sensibilities that inform rejection of Rashi. And also, I would say, important to me at least, and I think something that should perhaps be discussed more, the rhetoric in which rejection of Rashi is couched. Sometimes people will quietly reject Rashi, but with respect. Other times people will reject Rashi from a position of superiority. It really starts as early as Ibn Ezra, the first Spanish commentator to meet Rashi, not in Spain, but in Christian Europe. And he's horrified by this Rabbi Solomon he keeps hearing about. Never heard about this guy before when I was in Al-Andalus. Everyone seems to love him over here, and he's offering Midrashic interpretations. He thinks he writes very cuttingly in one place, although perhaps prudently not in his Torah commentary itself, that Rashi thinks he's offering plain sense interpretation, and he manages this only one time in 1,000, which is not a very good grade. So that's one type of critic who is very worried to assert the primacy of Pshat and sees Rashi muddying the waters. In the case of someone like Ramban, you have something of that sensibility as well, but you also have Rashi being completely unaware of the Kabbalistic plane of meaning in the Torah, and that would be a wholly different approach. There are some Kabbalists who appropriate Rashi and try to argue that he actually is a mystic. The ones that I wrote about the most are some pretty hardcore rationalists who object to Rashi, I would say, on grounds of both exegetical rationalism and theological rationalism. Brings us back to some of the comments we made earlier about some of the seemingly fantastical ideas that Rashi includes in his commentary that defy empirical experience, that defy finalities of science, and so on and so forth, or in some cases simply just seem to be hyper interpretation of scripture when all you have to do is read it straight up and you'll know exactly what scripture's trying to tell you. So I won't try to give you a full catalog of all these different figures and their slightly different approaches, but I would say on the whole, you have the objectors on exegetical grounds, and then you have what I would call the objectors to the Judaism that Rashi implicitly promotes through his commentary, a Judaism that they thought threatened the well-being of Jews and Judaism heading off into the future when their rationalist vision would be imperiled. And I would say, my conclusion, which wasn't, exactly hidden from view, is that in the long run, no one has ever heard of these obscure objectors. And we're sitting here doing a podcast not about them, but about Rashi. And so apparently Rashi has nothing to worry about in terms of his reputation. One might even say, in terms of theories of canonicity, that the very fact that he had objectors and overcame the objectors is part of what turned him into a classic. That's part of almost the definition of a classic: to meet the objectors and to win the day.
Right. Interesting. Although, as you may point out, we're only 1,000 years in the reception of Rashi.
That's a very good point. The story is not over, but as far as I can tell, there are large segments, as I mentioned. I got a note at the end of this course from one of these so-called secular teachers. She actually was the head of the department of Tanakh in her school, and she wrote a very long email to me about basically never having set eyes on a word of Rashi before taking my course, and how she was extremely...
That's an achievement, by the way.
Yeah,
to get into your adult life without...
Head of the Tanakh department at your school. But this is the polarization that you have in Israel. What was very heartwarming about this letter was she wrote with tremendous enthusiasm. I didn't follow up, I have to confess, but with tremendous enthusiasm about her intense desire to expose her students to Rashi on the view that this is part of their patrimony as well. But there's a certain sadness, I would say, from my point of view, in getting an email like that. Certainly a happiness that there was some inspiration that she drew from the course, but sadness in the sense that it's, as you say, completely remarkable that many Israelis, I think if you ask them who Rashi was, would say they've heard the name, but beyond that would be able to tell you extremely little about his achievement. And in that sense, part of the talking past each other that we Israelis are so famous for, especially of late, might be cured by all of us sitting down and reading Rashi together.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Of course, Professor, you didn't take into account that all these people are now going to be listening to this podcast and our conversation, and will draw inspiration.
You are full of very good points here, which I cannot argue with.
Exactly. I suppose one final question that I asked to many of my guests is, if you could sit down tonight and have dinner with Rashi, and have him open to answering any questions, what would you be asking him? What information would you be trying to get out of Rashi? Would he be sitting here, and would you be able to have an audience with him?
That's an interesting question that I don't think I've ever given thought to. I think this issue of his self-awareness and consciousness as he wrote, especially including some of these Midrashic ideas, it's so hard to get behind some of those and to figure out, what exactly he was thinking, especially in the case of some of the more fantastical ones. That's something I would be keen to hear if he were willing to throw light on. But I suppose it would just be difficult to get anything out of one's mouth. So odd would one be by sitting with such a formidable and great figure of post-Talmudic Judaism.
Fair enough. I suppose one fun thing that you could do if Rashi's there is to bring out all the scholarship on Rashi as it produced in the last few decades and say, okay, was Grossman right? Was Soloveitchik right? Was I correct? Who got the right end of the stick on this particular point?
Yeah, he might not care as much as some of us scholars do about some of the questions that we tackle in our scholarship. I suspect not.
Right. No, I couldn't imagine you actually care about that. Anyway, Professor Eric Lawee, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This has been a lot of fun. And I recommend everyone go and take a look at your book, which is certainly very enlightening. And look forward, hopefully, to having you back at some point in the future.
Okay, both thanks to you, and welcome the opportunity to come back.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi, edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.